Hello, Econ 200. Let's talk about some of the problems from the Chapter 10 homework. This video hopefully will be shorter than the last one I posted because for Chapter 10, really people didn't have a lot of difficulty with many of the problems, so I'm just going to go over three of them. The first two are both from Facts and Tools. Those are problems 4 and 5. And the last problem I'll go over is from Thinking and Problem Solving, problem number 4. So let's begin. Facts and Tools, problem 4. The text reads as follows. Considering what we've learned about externalities, should human-caused global warming be completely stopped? Explain using the language of social benefits and social costs. All right. So the answer to problem 4 is, given what we know about externalities, probably no. Global warming should not be completely stopped, or the human-caused portion of global warming should not be completely stopped. And the reason is going to be because that there are still some benefits that get generated that exceed the costs of global warming. And so while we probably want to reduce the amount of global warming that we're causing and cut back on some emissions of greenhouse gases, we would not want to eliminate all of them. So here's the reasoning. Imagine that this is a market where there is, you're producing something that emits carbon or, producing it emits carbon or emits methane gas or some other greenhouse gas, okay? So in equilibrium, we've got our demand curve, we have our supply curve, and if global warming were not an issue, if there was no externality in this market, all of the available gains from trade would be given by the area of this triangle to the left of equilibrium between the demand curve and the supply curve, telling us the difference between what it is worth to the buyers and what it is costing the sellers to produce all of those units. All right, so that's where we begin. But in this market, as I said, we've got this externality. You are emitting greenhouse gases. Those greenhouse gases create global warming, which creates an external cost, a cost that is not only borne by the buyers and the sellers in this market. So whatever that cost is, we mark a line, right? The distance between this red supply curve and this green social cost curve, that difference is the external cost that's being generated by this market, okay? Which tells us that we want to stop this market at this point here. We would like the trades to stop where the social cost curve intersects the demand curve. Call that Q star. Now, what happens here? Notice that on all of these units to the left of Q star, the value to the buyers is greater than the social cost of producing those goods, which means that the value is greater than the cost of production to the seller plus the cost of emitting those greenhouse gases, okay? So this Q star here would likely be consistent with a level of greenhouse gas emissions where you do get some global warming, okay? And the area of gains from trade, remember that if there was no externality, the area of gains from trade would be this large triangle here, bounded by the demand curve and the supply curve. Given that you have the externality, you have a smaller triangle of gains from trade, but it's still there. Okay, once you have this external cost that you're considering, the gains from trade are represented by this green rectangle, which is bounded by the demand curve and the social cost curve. Okay. Now, if you allow all of these trades to happen, you'll maximize those benefits to society. But now suppose that we were to cut emissions, we were to reduce output in this market to below Q star. Well, at Q star, we get all of this area of benefits to society. But as you start cutting back more and more units, notice that you're now losing some gains from trade. Okay, and you can think about this in terms of, imagine if what it took to end global warming or to completely stop global warming was you would have to eliminate all cars, all airplanes, all train transportation, and you'd have to get rid of like air conditioning and 40 or 50% of consumer goods, because there's greenhouse gases that get emitted as part of that production process. Hopefully it's intuitive to you that eliminating all of that from the world, while it would probably stop global warming, would not end up being a net benefit to humanity, right? We have to balance the costs of global warming against the benefits of all the things that we get from a modern economy. The only way in which it would be true that we want to completely end global warming would be if the costs were so great that the social cost curve was all the way up here, right? If you had a social cost curve that hit the demand curve at this point at the y-axis, then it would be true that global warming was so costly that we should completely eliminate it. It would be, worth it to end all of the production in this market. But absent that being the case, you probably still want there to be some global warming, because it's an unavoidable byproduct of the benefits of production in this market. So that brings us to problem 5 in Facts and Tools. And I'm not going to read all of the lead-in material, but basically you're given a table that gives you 3 different cases for SUVs, for fashionable clothes, and for ideas. You're supposed to indicate whether what is being discussed is an external cost or benefit, what is the size of that external cost or benefit, and given what we know about economics, would that suggest that we should tax or subsidize this market? Okay, so we start with the case of SUVs. It says, in the market for automobiles, the private benefit of one more small SUV is $20,000, and the social cost of one more small SUV is $30,000. All right, well, I've got a graph to help illustrate. Focus on the left-hand side of this page for now. We'll get to 5B in a moment. All right, in this market, the private benefit is $20,000. That means in equilibrium, the value to that next consumer is $20,000. So that's equal to the equilibrium price. But the private cost, the social cost is more than $20,000. The social cost is $30,000. It's going to be above, which tells you that if the social cost, notice that the supply curve tells us the private cost and the private benefit in equilibrium are both $20,000. So if the social cost is greater than the private cost, that tells us there's a negative externality. We've got a social cost curve that is going to lie above the supply curve. And we are also told by the problem that, shouldn't be there, pardon me. If you go up to the social cost curve from the equilibrium, it's a $30,000 cost to society. Okay, so first of all, are we dealing with a cost or a benefit? Clearly, it's a cost. What is the size of that cost or benefit? Well, it's going to be the difference between the private cost or the private benefit and the social cost. That's $30,000 minus $20,000. It is a $10,000 size. And given what we know about externalities, should we tax or subsidize? Well, when you have a negative externality, you want to discourage production, so you want to tax this market. In fact, you want to tax it by the $10,000 per unit. That would take this supply curve and shift it up so that it's exactly overlapping the social cost curve. So for SUVs, we would want to tax them. Part B. And Part B, I believe, this is probably why people had difficulty. I have a feeling most people had 5A. That wasn't really a problem. Part B is where things get a little bit more complicated. And I apologize for the authors in this case, because they're kind of getting a little cute with the way that they set up this problem, because it's a little different than the way they talk about it in the textbook. So here goes. Part B. In the market for fashionable clothes, the marginal social benefit of one more dress per person is $100. and the marginal private benefit is $500. So back to the private benefit lines up with equilibrium, $500. Bonus, can you tell an externality story that makes sense of these numbers? I'll give you that story in a moment. But notice in this case, the private value is $500. The social value is less than that. It's $100. Now, what you've seen so far in any lecture that I've given, and I think in the textbook and also in the online lectures, if there is a value, a social value, that's always been talked about as being greater than the private value. So you have above the demand curve, you'll have a social value curve. And if there's a cost, you put that on top of the supply curve and you get a social cost curve. That's not the way they've done it here. They've taken a social cost and subtracted it from the demand curve, so that what you have is a social benefit curve that lies below the demand curve, or a social value curve that's below the demand curve. Now, obviously, this is not to scale, but that's $500. And here, oh no. Once again, I did exactly the same thing that I did over there. You go from here down to the social value curve, and there it's at $100. Okay? So that's why part B is confusing. What they're basically telling you is trades in this market have kind of negative spillover effects to other people, but instead of showing you that by raising the cost above the supply curve, they've shown it to you by dropping the social value curve below the demand curve. Now, first of all, before I tell you the story of why this might make sense, please note that on the midterm exam, I'm not going to give you a problem like this where you have social value below demand or social cost below the supply curve. Okay, I'm gonna stick to the way I've talked about it in my lecture videos and also the way it's shown in the textbook. How would this make sense that the private benefit is greater than the social benefit for fashionable clothes? It basically comes down to a story of status and signaling. Part of the reason to buy fashionable clothes is to get attention, right? Is to have people pay attention to you, and so that hopefully that will raise your status and, you know, perhaps make you more popular, make you more attractive to potential mates, and so on. Okay, well, if your status is raised, if you become more popular, if you are attracting more attention and attracting more mates, potential mates, then those are all having to come from somewhere, right? They're all coming from other people who are getting less attention because that people's attention is being shifted to you away from other people. And anybody who wants to date you because you're now a more fashionably dressed, more attractive person, that person now no longer wants to date other people that they would have been willing to date. So while you are benefiting, other people are losing out on benefits that they were having before, and so the social value could be lower than the private value. All right, so that is the story that could make sense of that. Going back to our table, is it a cost or benefit? It's a cost, an external cost. What is the size? Well, it's going to be the $500 private benefit minus the $100 social benefit. So the cost is $400. And should you tax or subsidize it? Tax. And problem 5C. Notice that this graph is a little skewed. It's because of the variance in the numbers that they're talking about. All right, let me see. Part C, in the market for really good ideas that will dramatically change the world for the better, the private benefit of one more really good idea, from speakers' fees, book sales, patents, etc., is $1 million. So that's what we have down here. $1 million is where supply and demand intersect each other. The marginal social benefit is $1 billion. So If that's 1 million, then we've got a social value curve that's going to be above that demand curve. Let's put it right here. So at the margin, this is worth $1 million to the author or the inventor, whoever comes up with the idea. But if you take in all of the positive spillover benefits to society on that marginal unit, if you go up to the social value curve, it's a $1 billion benefit. Okay? So, external cost or benefit, it's an external benefit. What is the size? Well, it's $999 million. Right? It's the 1 billion minus 1 million. Should you tax or subsidize the creation of these ideas? Subsidize. Okay? So that's the answer to problem 5. Again, I suspect it was this middle one on fashionable clothing that gave people the most difficulty. Hopefully the rest of it was pretty straightforward and intuitive to you. And that brings us to the final problem. Thinking and problem solving, problem number 4. Get to that in the textbook. Okay, so this one also has a lot of build-up in the couple paragraphs before they get to the extra questions. I'm not going to read through that, but basically they're talking about the market for women's romance novels, and they discuss the fact that that creates unreasonable expectations on real men to live up to the way that the men in the romance novels are. All right, so question 4A. It says, consider the following market. Romance novels impose an external cost on men who have to try to live up to these unrealistic expectations. Illustrate the effect of this external cost in the figure. Well, that's pretty straightforward. Having that external cost creates a curve that is above the supply curve, which is the social cost curve. The cost of producing these novels to the author and the publisher, plus the external cost to men in the forms of unrealistic expectations. Part B, illustrate in the figure the deadweight loss from the externality before a tax or other solution is imposed. Okay, well, in equilibrium, quantity of units is going to be right here, cutting through equilibrium. Notice that at this equilibrium point, you've got quite a few units where the social cost of producing the good exceeds the value to the reader, okay, of purchasing those novels. So that difference between the social cost and the private benefit on all the units that get traded beyond this point where social cost is equal to demand, that is going to be your deadweight loss. Part C. If the government decides to compensate for the externality by imposing a tax on romance novels, should the tax be high enough to stop everyone from reading the novels? Why or why not? Well, the answer is going to be no. The tax shouldn't be that high. A couple of reasons why not. First of all, notice that the socially optimal level of output is here at Q star. Right? So the tax should just be enough to compensate the social cost. And this graph indicates we don't want to eliminate these novels entirely. If we eliminated them entirely, then we'd be getting rid of all of the gains from trade. So this, problem 4C, that's exactly the same reasoning as we had in problem 4 in facts and tools with climate change. Even though there are negative externalities, that doesn't mean that the benefits don't exceed the social costs on some of the units that get traded. So we don't want to tax so much that the social cost curve goes all the way up here and we eliminate the novels entirely. We would just want to discourage them up to the point where private benefit is equal to social cost. Part D, show graphically how big the tax should be per novel. Well, the tax should be equal to the external cost, right? It should be equal to the distance between the supply curve and the social cost curve. So that would be the optimal tax per novel, that distance right there. Finally, part E, as long as the government spends the money efficiently, does it matter what the government spends the money from the romance novel tax on? In other words, could the government just use the money to pay for necessary roads and bridges, or does it need to spend the money to fix the harmful social effects of romance novels? Well, the answer is it doesn't really matter what they spend the money on. Once you have imposed the tax, you've made this market efficient, okay? If the tax is equal to the external cost, then you have completely compensated for the social losses of those novels, and the market has been made efficient. It doesn't need you to spend money fixing the problem in order to make the market more efficient. In fact, and this is not something that I put in the answer key, but in fact, if the government did take the revenues from this tax and they did use it to reduce the harms from, or the purported harms from these romance novels, what that would actually mean is this social cost curve would be closer to the supply curve than it currently is, because the negative externality wouldn't be as big. The government would be reducing that that external cost through whatever the spending was, whether that's to make the men more resilient to the high expectations, or whether it's to pay for advertising to make sure everybody's aware that no, in fact, men can't be expected to be like the guys in romance novels, etc. Whatever that is, that would reduce the negative externality and bring it closer to the to the supply curve. And so if you did that, you actually wouldn't want to tax as much as if you're just spending the money on bridges and roads and whatnot. Okay, so no, it's not necessary to spend the money that you raise on the problem that you're raising the money from. So that is the answer to problem 4, and that is it for the chapter 10 homework problems. Hope that this video has been useful to you, and I hope that I will see you guys on Monday at the review session as we prepare for the second midterm. As always, be flexible, communicate, and stay awesome. Take care, everybody.